I thought that I would start by introducing the main characters as I picture them. The first is Perry Mason as played by Raymond Burr. Next is Miss Della Street. Then there is Paul Drake and his wife Sue, the men who sat on the other side of the courtroom, L.T. Tragg and Hamilton Berger, district attorney. Then last but not least, Della's sister Lori and her fiancé Mike. Perry Mason sat in his large office behind his large oak desk and looked around. All was quiet, too quiet. He looked over and saw that his handmade antique clock was no longer working. This clock meant a lot to him, because it was given to him when his grandfather had passed away over 20 years ago. It had sat on the mantel at his grandparents' house for he did not know how long, and it had been on his grandmother's parents' mantel prior to that. It was a banjo-style Chelsea clock that rang ship's bells. It had gold embossing and was absolutely beautiful. Perry walked over to the clock and checked to see if it needed winding. It did not. In fact, it was wound tight. It was not wound too tight though, because only he did the winding, and he was always a very careful man about that clock. It was very well secured by him to make sure that it did not fall. Perry had always had the same man do the work and upkeep on the clock. He was a man in his 60s now who had been fixing clocks for years. He always said that he was a third-generation clock repair man. Perry gave him a call and made an appointment for the man to come out and take a look at the clock in the morning. It was a Friday and most law offices were closed here in LA, but Perry Mason always came in for the morning hours in case one of his clients could not miss work during the week. He was glad that his clock repair man worked weekends too. Today was Della's sister Lori's birthday party and he was expected to be there by 6:30. He had been looking forward to the party as he had just finished the case with Lori's boyfriend Mike. He also knew that Mike had plans to ask Lori to marry him. Mike had not decided whether or not he was going to ask her in front of everyone or make the announcement at the party. Della and Mike had been busy getting ready for the party, and so Della had taken the afternoon off. Without her in the office, he had found the place very dull. But now it was time for a party, so off he went. As Perry entered the Kavanaugh restaurant where the party was going to be held in a private room, he spotted Della busy getting things ready. The room looked great and he was pleased to see Della's mother helping her with the decorations. Della's father sat in the corner rolling napkins and looked as though he could use a hand. So Perry walked over to Della and her mother and said hello, then headed to help Della's father out. Perry walked over to Greg Street and they shook hands. They both started making some little deco rations that Della and her mother Marian had given them to do and got busy. Everything was almost done and Perry saw Mike's parents come in. He and Della introduced them to the streets when Perry's brother Dave and Steve Janik came in. It was going to be a nice quiet party. The dinner was delicious as always and the group got to enjoy the 360-degree view of the city that the restaurant offered. It turned slowly so that you could not feel it and it gave you a full view every 90 minutes of the city. Mike had already popped the question and Lori showed off her ring with a big smile. Everyone kissed and hugged her. The congratulations came from everyone also. It was a great night. Once the dinner was over, everyone went out to dance on the large dance floor. Perry saw that there was a man for every girl, because two of Lori's friends had shown up and once again Dave spent the time dancing with Lori's friend Donna. She was the same one that he had danced with the last time that he and Della had gone out with Lori and Mike. Perry and Della danced most of the dances, but they did switch partners and danced with Lori and Mike respectfully. Della's mother and father were both good dancers, and Perry could tell where Della had gotten her talent. As the night went by, Della's mother and father and Mike and Lori wanted to take an engagement photo of all of them, so Perry offered to take the picture. He was thinking about how someday he would hope that Della would be willing to say yes to him when he asked her to marry him. The time never seemed to be the right time. There was always a reason why he did not ask her. They were busy on a case, her sister was getting married, always something. Della's mother and father would not be staying at Della and Laurie's house. They enjoyed getting a motel room and coming over for a visit. It gave them both privacy. Laurie Della and them Della's father told him. He had even offered to let them stay at his penthouse. They were people of class and Perry accepted this. When the party was over, it was decided that they would go back to Della and Laurie's house. It was already 11 and Della's parents thanked them for the invite but thought that it would be good for them to go back to their hotel. They would come over sometime the next morning. Perry stayed behind to help Della pick up the things from the party. It gave them a chance to be alone. And he knew that she would not leave without cleaning. She had ridden to the party with Mike and would not listen to Laurie telling her that she would help clean up. Once everyone had left, Della got busy cleaning and throwing away some of the decorations while Perry worked on those darn little napkin things that had been made into different shapes. It was just as hard to get them back to normal shape as it had been to make the shapes. He was working on about the 10th one when Perry saw a hand reach over and take one of them. It was Della. She knew how to do them the easy way and had all of the napkins the way they should be in about 10 minutes. If I had been left alone, I would have still been working on these things at Laurie's next party, Perry thought to himself. Both Perry and Della knew that Della's house was going to be noisy and full of fun with Laurie and her wild bunch, as they are called. They loved the group, but it could be loud. Perry smiled at her. Miss Street, shall we go to your house now, or my house? Della wanted to go to his house, but this was Laurie's birthday and she thought that it might be considered rude if she did not go right home that night. The room was clean and there was no excuse for them staying at the restaurant any longer. I will take a rain check on the invite to your home, but for now we better go to my house. I am sure that Laurie and Mike are waiting for us, Della told him. Della had just bent down to give Perry a kiss when the door to the room opened. She turned and saw her mother standing there. Excuse me. I think I might have lost one of my earrings here. Greg and I looked everywhere in the car, she told them. Greg had gone to the manager of the restaurant to ask if someone had turned the earring in. They had not turned it in, so all four of them looked over the room. The earring was nowhere to be found. Della felt sorry for her mother. Her mother had received these earrings for her 30th wedding anniversary. But the trouble was the earring could have been lost anywhere, and it was a simple post-style diamond. The manager of the restaurant promised that if anyone found the earring he would call them, and with that, they gave both their phone number and Della's. Della, your father and I were thinking about taking you and Laurie and Mike out for breakfast tomorrow morning. Of course, you are invited, Perry. Thank you so much for offering, but the office is open on Saturday until noon. I would love to go with you to a brunch if you could, Della offered. Then it is all set. I trust that you and Laurie have some place that you know of where the food is good. Marion asked her daughter. Perry, will you be coming too? It would be my pleasure. I will go with Della when the office closes, Perry told him. He knew that Jerry from the clock shop would be there at 9, and if he could not fix his clock there, he would have to take the clock to his shop, so lunch would be fine with him. He liked Della's parents, and hoped that they liked him too. Jerry Diamond was busy at his shop working a little later than usual when his son-in-law came in one store. Once again. Dad, I have told you that you should be at home resting, not here at the shop working. What am I to do with you? He asked. This is my shop and I like working here. It keeps me busy. When I get home there is no one there to greet Me anymore. Not since my Flo passed away. But the developer will offer you a huge profit. You can retire and work out of your house. You have a good amount of customers who will use you at home or at your shop. Jason offered again. I told you no. I do not want to move and I do not care what the developers offer me. Jerry told him for about the 10th time that month. You know that Kathy and I are only interested in you and your well-being, he told him. No, you want me to give up on my business and have no reason to live. That's what I think. Jerry told him. He was sorry that he had to say that, but he felt that it was the truth. Jerry and his daughter had been trying to convince him to sell the shop ever since he had heard from the developers. All the two of them did was think about the money that would be made, not the loss to him. Tomorrow morning he would see Perry Mason and tell him what was going on with his business. It was not only his son-in-law that was bothering him. He was now starting to get phone calls and they were getting to be quite annoying. He wanted to know what his rights were. As Perry and Della pulled into her driveway, they could see that what they had thought would be was. There was every light on in the house and they could hear the music from the driveway. It was now midnight and Della was going to have to quiet the party down. Perry smiled at her and took her by the arm and walked into the house. Everyone from the party was there except for Della's parents. Mike's parents had come by for another toast to the newly engaged couple, and had been waiting for Perry and Della to arrive. Della was so happy for Lori. She deserved the best and she had the best with Mike, of that Della was sure. Perry reached over and turned down the music just a little. Della smiled and said, I am sorry, but we have neighbors and it is after midnight. We can celebrate all we want, but we have to keep it low, all right. People milled around for about another hour and finally started to leave. Della and Lori were happy when the only ones left at the house were Mike and Perry. Now they could be their natural selves and relax. Perry took a seat on the couch next to Della and Mike, and Lori sat on the love seat next to the couch. They sat back and sipped a little more champagne, and then they all knew it was time for the men to leave. It was now way after 2 and Della and Perry had work in the morning. Perry gave Della a long passionate kiss. And then left. Mike left at the same time and the house was quiet. 7 a.m. came early at the street house that day. Della had just had about 4 hours sleep and her face showed it. Good God, she was going to be 29 this year, nearly 30. She could not keep up with the young crowd much anymore. You are approaching middle age, she thought to herself. When Della came into the office, she was surprised to find Perry there. He had spent the night on the couch in the office, rather go home and drive back. He always had a change of clothes there and a fully stocked bathroom. The couch wasn't the best place to sleep, but he had made it work more than once. Della leaned over and gave her man a kiss. He opened his eyes immediately and put both of his arms around her neck. It was not often that he got to wake up to her. As a matter of fact, he had never been woken by her kiss and he liked it. Unfortunately, while the two of them were kissing, they did not hear the outer office door open and Jerry coming in to fix the clock. Jerry smiled as he saw the two people on the couch kissing and cleared his throat to let them know that he was there. Della looked up at him and blushed crimson red. How stupid of her not to shut the door tight when she came in. She stood up and smiled. Good morning, Jerry. Could you please excuse me for a moment? The clock is where it always is, Perry told him as he headed to the bathroom to get ready for a morning of work. Jerry knew his work and had the clock up and running like a brand new clock within 1/2 an hour. It had just gotten out of adjustment from the small quake that LA had suffered the day before. It was only a 3.2 earthquake. But because the clock was so sensitive it got knocked out of line. Perry was getting ready to write him a check when Jerry asked him how much he would charge for an office visit. No charge, my friend, for something simple. What is wrong, Jerry? Perry asked. Well, I am having some problems at my store. It seems that about 2 months ago some developers came to me and offered me a very high price for the building where I have my store. It has been there for almost 80 years and my apartment is above it. I have lived there my entire life. My son-in-law Jason has been trying to get me to sell and I keep telling him no. But now I have been getting calls that have been threatening in nature. The one that I got this morning was that I had better keep a good eye on my back, he told them. Perry thought for a moment. I will have Paul, my private investigator, look into this and get back to you. In the meantime, I would let the police know what is going on. There is word on the street that some of the new developers in the city do use strong arms. Be careful, Perry told him. He started to write out a check to the man. And he held his hand up. No charge today. It is an honor working on such a wonderful clock. Della looked at Perry. She knew as well as he did that sometimes when a developer wanted a certain piece of property they could be difficult to deal with. With Jerry in his 60s, he would make a good profit. Della, get Paul on the phone and ask him to come and see us if he is in the building. If he is not, I will talk to him on the phone. Perry asked her. The rest of the morning was spent waiting on different clients and going over some briefs for a court hearing that was scheduled for the next Wednesday. At noon the office closed, and as promised, Perry and Della closed the office at noon and went to Della's house to meet her parents. When they got to her house they found her parents there and glad to see them. The dinner was lively and Perry and Della were glad to see Mike and his parents there too. The two families were going to be one soon and they should get to know each other. Mike and Lori talked about the wedding that they wanted. They wanted it all, a big wedding, a church, and a ride through the park with a horse and buggy. It sounded great and expensive to Della, but she thought it sounded like fun. Greg Street loved his children, but Lori was always the playful one. Della had been studious and a student from grade school. He wanted the best for the both of them and would somehow come up with the money to marry the both of them. He was pleased with Lori's choice and he had heard about Della and Perry from Marion. After the brunch, Perry went home so that Della and Lori could spend time with her parents. He knew that they did not get to see each other often and that Della missed them. Della was happy to have the day with her mom and dad. They lived just 100 miles away, but she did not get to see them enough. The day was spent with memories and her father and Mike watched the football game together. Marion could not help but notice the 24 roses that were on the stand next to the television. She had assumed that they came from Mike. She smiled at Della and said, Lori has found a fine man, he even sent her these flowers. They are beautiful, she told her. Lori came in and smiled. What do you think of the flowers Perry sent Della? Marion smiled at Della and said, oh, they are nice. Congratulations. He gave them to her just for being her, that's what the card said. Lori. Della scolded. He is just a nice man. That you love very much. Lori teased. Now girls, stop picking on each other, Marion laughed. The day was fun and Della and Lori were sad when their parents left for home. But they knew that the drive was going to take at least 2.5 hours. If there was traffic it could take longer. Their dad and mom wanted Sunday to rest as they both had to be at work on Monday morning. Jerry had a bad weekend. His son-in-law called him 3 times and another man called him once again. He should sell before there was nothing left for him to sell. That is what the man on the phone said to him this time, he answered. When he was in the shower Sunday morning he heard a noise downstairs. He was sure that someone was down there, so he snuck down the back stairs. There in the middle of the floor was a man with a mask over his face, smashing some of his cases. When he yelled, the man ran out of the store. But the damage had been done, and by the time the police were there the man was long gone. He would have to call Mr. Mason in the morning. But then he got a call from his son-in-law Jason. Jason wanted to talk to him once again about selling the building. How many times did he have to tell his son-in-law that he was not interested in selling the store or the building to anyone? There were 6 other tenants that lived in the building, and 3 of them had been there over 20 years. He knew if a developer bought the building that his friends and tenants would be homeless and the new owner would not care. So with reluctance he went over to see his son-in-law Jerry. He knew that his daughter Kathy was gone for the weekend with friends. As Jerry came up the driveway he saw no cars. On the road there had been 1 or 2 cars, but he did not take note of them. Jerry walked up to the house and noticed the open front door. He knocked and got no answer, so he pushed the door open and walked on in. He was calling for his son-in-law but no answer, and then he entered into the kitchen. On the floor lay his son-in-law Jerry in a pool of blood. He reached down and checked for a pulse that he was sure was not there, and then panicked. He left the scene and went back home. 2 hours later he got a call from his daughter Kathy telling him that her husband had been killed. She was so upset and he asked her to come over and stay with him while the police were there. Kathy accepted her father's invitation and was glad that he was there for support. But how could he look his daughter in the eye? He had seen her husband lying on the floor and did nothing. He had gone home and hid like the coward he was. When the police came to his home and shop that Sunday he knew that someone had seen him. So he did not deny being there, but claimed that he had been alive. Lt. Trag of Homicide did not believe him. Of that he was sure. He did not know what to do. He would have to talk to Perry Mason again. Monday morning came and life at the Perry Mason office was as it normally was. Della and Perry were at work for about an hour when Paul came in. Trouble at the clock shop, Perry. Jason Fielding was murdered, and your clock-making friend's fingerprints are all over the place. Perry knew that Jerry would be a suspect. He wanted to call Jerry right away, but to his surprise Jerry came into the office. He was there to tell the truth. He needed advice on what to do. Paul, Della and Perry all took a seat and listened to his story. It was clear that he needed to go to the police with his story, but Paul would look into it right away. No matter what, someone had murdered Jason Diamond and he was the most likely suspect now. Take it easy and go back to work at the shop. I will keep in touch. Paul Drake will start looking into things today and perhaps we will have an answer for you soon. Perry promised him. After Jerry had left, Perry turned to Paul. Paul, the first need you to check into who might have wanted this man dead, who is with the developer, and what kind of man this Jason Fielding was. On my way, Paul told him and left. Della, I need you to see what is going on in the neighborhood too. Ask around, see if anyone else has been contacted or threatened by the developer. Perry had to work on his other case that was going to court as of Wednesday. He had affidavits and different types of forms to have filled out, and he was going to have to go to the clerk of courts for more paperwork. Everything was going well, and Perry thought that things were going to be okay until he got a call from the jail. It was Jerry Diamond. He had been arrested for the murder of his son-in-law Jason Fielding. Perry went right out to the jail and met with Jerry. He talked to him again about what had happened. The hearing about the bail would be in the morning. Perry Mason would be ready for him. It would mean that the lights would burn late at the office, but the three friends Perry, Paul and Della were used to it. Perry was busy filling out the motions and the paperwork, more and more of it for the next day. He wanted to have the information ready for the morning. He knew that Jerry was not wealthy and the bail money was going to come hard. Paul had been speaking to the tenants in the building. He wanted to know what they had heard and if any of them had been contacted by the developer. Every one of them had been contacted and offered a substantial amount if they could convince Jerry to sell the building. Some of the people had been there for a long time, and there were 2 apartments that had only been rented for about a year. He wanted to look into each of them and see what kind of people they were. Word on the street was that a developer under the name of Thompson Industries was offering very large sums of cash for certain land in the area. Thompson Industries was a large condominium builder and had wanted to change some of the older buildings in the area from walk-up apartments to condos. Most of the buildings in the area were poor in condition, and they would buy them dirt cheap and then sell the newly done-over buildings at a huge profit. The block that the clock shop was in was one of the only buildings left that had not been converted. Most of the owners had given up their property when they were offered a large sum of money. Those that did not go willingly had found themselves facing all kinds of charges, court litigation, and Board of Health issues. There was thought that someone who worked for the city was taking some kickback. Paul was looking it into further. Perry looked up at the clock and saw that it was past 10 in the night and Della had fallen asleep on the couch. He had hoped that he would hear from Paul, and he knew if there was anything to tell he would get a call. Paul was probably busy and not in the mood for a foolish phone call. Perry looked at Della sleeping on the couch and smiled. He thought of how wonderful it had been when she had woken him up on Saturday morning and thought that he would do that to her. He bent over and kissed her. Della opened her eyes and smiled. "Hello, Perry," and then she put her arms around his neck and kissed him tenderly. The 2 of them took a seat on the couch and just held each other tight for a few minutes. It was then that they remembered that neither one of them had eaten since lunch. Perry took Della by the hand and led her out through the back door, down the hallway and to the elevator, as they had done 1,000 times before. When they reached their cars, they kissed goodnight and headed back to their homes. It had been another long day at the office. The next day Della went straight to the courthouse and met Perry on the steps. She was glad to see him standing there. He was so handsome, and she thought that she could eat him up just like candy before court, but she kept her dignity and smiled a good morning to him. Perry watched as Della walked up the stairs toward him and smiled. No matter what the time was, day or night, she always looked good. She had a way of holding herself that demanded respect, and that was one of the things that he loved about her. This was going to be a tough day in court. His client Jerry had lied to the police at first and had left the scene of a murder. His son-in-law had been trying to get him to sell the business, and times had been hard between them. It seemed odd that the day that Jerry decided to go to his daughter's house was a day when his daughter was not there. Because of the family problem, he had not been over to her house in over 6 months. Hamilton Berger looked up to see Perry Mason and Della Street walk into the courtroom. He had heard that Perry would be defending the man and looked forward to another battle of the minds. This client had been seen at the murder scene, had left fingerprints everywhere, and had been in a long-standing battle with his son-in-law about selling the building that he owned. He was guilty of that, Berger was sure. After exchanging friendly hellos, the 2 lawyers went right to work. Berger did not want for Jerry Diamond to be offered bail at all. He had killed that man without sorrow and could easily leave the country with the amount of money that he had in the bank. Perry argued that Jerry Diamond had lived in the same home his whole life and he owned his own business. He would not leave town. The reason his son-in-law and he were at odds was because he wanted to stay at his home and not move. It did not make any sense that he would want to leave town now. Bail was set at $200,000, and with that Jerry Diamond would be released later on that afternoon. Perry did not see Jerry's car in the courtroom and saw the look of disappointment on his face. As Jerry looked around the room, Perry was going to go with Della and talk to Kathy. He had met her a few times and thought she was a nice lady. He would bring Della with him. Sometimes women talk to each other better than they did to a man. Della was picking up the things off the courtroom desk when Paul came in. He had some news for Perry. But Perry had just left. He will meet us at the office in an hour. Can it wait? Yes. But it is pretty good. He took Della by the arm, and as they walked out of the courtroom he let her in on what he knew. It seems that this developer Thomason Industries has been calling everyone they try the legal avenues, but if that does not work, they have been known to be strong-armed. When they were in Chicago a few years ago, they were one of the most dangerous firms to deal with. Once they had made their money and had gotten all that they could, they came here. The owner of the business is a man named Dean Kirk. He started as one of those house flippers and got bigger and bigger as time went by. He started this business and had made millions of dollars over the years. He had ties to the bad part of town and was a man that you had to be careful when you were around him, or you might find yourself wearing cement galoshes. There has never been any proof that this company has actually committed a murder, but they have been known to strong-arm many a man that does not want to do what they want him to do. There has been instances of buildings burning down and vandalized, he told her. I will tell him as soon as I see him. You go ahead and look even deeper, Della told him. Della arrived back at the office just after 1. She was pleased to find Perry sitting at his desk. She told him what Paul had told her, and he smiled. I have been waiting for you, my dear. I would like to go and see Kathy Diamond. She might be more open to another woman if you don't mind. I am ready. Kathy is a lovely girl. I have met her several times when I go to put a new battery in my watch or something. She is always smiling and helpful, Della told him. The couple walked out the back door of the office once again and headed over to see Kathy. When they pulled up in front, Kathy came out to welcome them in. Hi Perry, Della, I wish this was under better circumstances. She offered them a seat in the living room. The house was clean and neat but in need of repair. Della and Perry could see that the paint on the ceiling was actually peeling, something that would take years to happen. Kathy, I know that it is hard to listen to this, but your father did not kill your husband. We need to try to find out who did. Did anyone ever call and make any threats to him that you know of? Della asked her. I know that he has been really worried about the things for the last couple of months. He wanted my father to sell his business because he was afraid of what would happen if he did not sell. 3 months ago a man called from Thompson Industries and he has been a basket case ever since. She started to tear up but held herself together. I think that they had given him some money to talk my father into selling his building, and he needed my father to sell, but he just would not sell. I am sorry to say this, but this house is in desperate need of repair. What makes you think that he received money from them? Perry asked. Kathy looked down and thought for a minute. My husband was not perfect. He had a bad habit of gambling. He had quit for almost 5 years, but I think that he had started once again. We were getting lots of calls, and when I answered them they would hang up on me. When Jason answered, he went into another room so that I could not hear what was being said. I am sorry about what happened, but your father is innocent. I know that, and you know that deep In your heart too. He needs your support now. Please go and see him. Della asked her. He is lonely and worried. Kathy thought for a minute and told them that she would call him that night. I love my dad, I just do not understand why he left the house and left my husband lying there in the kitchen. Where I was going to find him. He could have called me at least, she told them. As Perry pulled away, he looked at Della. He wanted to spend some quiet time with just her and him. It was nice to be with others, but sometimes it was even nicer to spend some time with each other alone. He could feel her body as it pressed against his as they rode down the street and said, "How about getting some dinner? We still have some more work to do, but we." He held her arm as they walked into the cafe and enjoyed a quiet meal at a quiet table away from the bustling crowd of the city. They both wanted some privacy and were seated at a table in the back. Perry held both of Della's hands across the table. I miss you sometimes when I even am close to you, but we cannot touch. Silly of me. Della squeezed both his hands and said, it is something that is hard to explain, but your words describe my feeling exactly. The two of them ate dinner in a quiet, happy silence. It was time for them to enjoy the time with just them, and they were happy. Once they got back to the office, it was back to work for the two of them. Once more. There was so much work to do and so many laws to read to help Jerry get freed and the correct person get time in prison. There would be actions, counter-actions, affidavits and more in the coming days, and tomorrow he had another case that was going to be heard about insurance fraud. A good attorney is never lonely, he had told Della many times. When the people are not knocking on the door, that is the time to really worry. The two of them worked once more way into the night. At about 10:30 Perry decided to call it a night. They had not heard anything more from Paul and hoped that he would have luck in the morning. Or sometime soon. The next day the case went well for the clients of Mr. Mason, as they usually did, and by Friday the jury had come in with a positive decision. Della was so proud of Perry. He helped so many people. And usually won his case. When the jury came in it was only 4:30, and for once it was a Friday. And Della and Perry would be going home at a normal time. Della smiled at Perry and laughed as he took her by the arm and walked together out of the court house. How would you like to go with me somewhere? I do not care where, any place you name it. Perry offered her. I would like to go to the carnival that is in my neighborhood, she asked him. All right, Miss Street. We will go to a carnival. I will go home and get dressed and then I will come to pick you up. I am sure that you want to change clothes too. Perry told her with a smile. When Perry came to get Della that evening, she was wearing pants. It was not often that he saw her in pants. She was dressed with taste as always, but she had sneakers on and he had never noticed how much shorter than him she was really. Without her heels she was only 5'5", and when he stood up he was over 6 feet. She didn't seem to mind though, and smiled as they walked to his car together. That night they ate a big ball of cotton candy and played every game that they had to offer, and Perry won her a big stuffed animal. They laughed and enjoyed themselves as though they were both 10 years younger. They hugged and rode a couple of rides. When they got home the two of them were exhausted when they returned to Della's house. Della and Perry enjoyed themselves so much that they swore that they would both go to another carnival together. Lori could not believe that her stuffed shirt sister and her boyfriend, a famous lawyer, had spent the night at a carnival and had such a good time. You two look like two young people who went out and had some fun. I think that is just what the doctor ordered. You should try to do that again, she told them. Mike smiled as he watched the two of them laughing and talking about the stuffed animal that Perry had won. Della. Next time we should go together maybe, Mike told them. Just as Perry was getting ready to go home, his phone rang. It was Paul. He finally had some news for them. Would it be alright if he came over? Paul asked. Within 15 minutes the doorbell rang and they let Paul in. Mike had left when he heard that Paul was coming over and Lori had gone to her room. They both knew that Perry and Della would want to speak to Paul alone. Paul took a seat in the living room and gladly accepted the cup of coffee that Della offered him. I have some news for you. Jason Fielding was deeply in debt. He owed to the big guys, the ones that liked to break bones, and was worried sick. He was contacted by Dean Kirk, and in exchange for getting the building that belonged to Jerry Diamond, he was trying his best to get Jerry to sell, and as Jerry refused, Dean and his goons was pressuring Jason every day. On the day that Jason was murdered, he had been contacted via threats by this group. I believe it was Jason that actually went to Jerry's store and vandalized it. When the police investigated, they found an outfit that described what the man had been wearing that day, and Jason's weight and height matched that of the man who had vandalized the store that morning. But when going over the tenants that live upstairs, there is one couple who have lived there for only 6 months. The couple's name is Brown, and Mr. Glenn Brown works for Dean Kirk. He was a plant that had been placed at the building to try to help force Jerry to sell. He then took a breath and leaned back on the chair. Jerry had been looking into the murder himself. He had never had any real arguments with anyone before. This corporation had tried to take over his building. His tenants were like family to him, and he wanted to know who would have murdered the son-in-law. He knew that Jason had at one time had a gambling problem, but he had not gambled in a long time. He was never happier when Kathy came to see him. Dad, I know that you did not do the murder, but why did you just leave him on the floor for me to find him? It was the worst thing that you could ever imagine, finding your spouse dead on the floor murdered. You should have stayed and reported that to the police. Kathy told him. I was scared. Jason and I had been fighting, and I knew that the police would think that it was me that had murdered him. I just panicked. Please forgive me, Jerry told his daughter. Kathy looked at her father and felt sorry for him. He was all she had left in the world as family, and she could not lose him. She gave him a big hug and asked him, do you have any ideas who would be interested or motivated to murder him? She asked her father. I have been thinking that it had something to do with his gambling debt. I know that he had started to gamble once again, and you can get into trouble real fast with some bad people. But things were getting very bad around here too. Someone broke into my store, and the calls that I was getting were getting more and more threatening, Jerry told his daughter. Dad, have the calls stopped? Kathy asked him. Jerry had not realized it, but the calls had stopped. He had not received any calls or visitors since Jason was murdered. He thought that he didn't want to think this way, but was it Jason that had been calling him and harassing him? Kathy knew what her father was thinking and was beginning to worry about that too. She knew that he had received a large sum of money some weeks before because he had been very calm, and her threatening phone calls had stopped completely. Did he get money to force her father to move? She just did not know what to do. I know that a company by the name of Thompson Industries was the company that was trying to buy the building, and that I had seen some of the workers outside of the store. But they never came in, they just took many pictures, Jerry told his daughter. I think that they were trying to show that my building was in need of repair and should be condemned. I am not sure, Jerry said. What surprised me is that even though the vandals went right into the store, none of the clocks were destroyed. Just the cases. It was almost as though someone was trying to scare you, not really harm the merchandise. If it had been someone from Thompson Industries, I don't think that they would have left the merchandise untouched. They would be there to put you out of business. Kathy told him in a worried tone. She did not want to worry and think it, but the vandal could have been her husband Jason. She just did not know. She turned around and gave her father a big hug. Don't worry, Dad, they will find out what happened. Perry Mason and Paul Drake are said to be the best in the business. I will try not to worry. Please call me in the morning, Jerry told his daughter. Paul had been busy looking more into Glenn Brown and where he had been the day of the murder. He knocked on his door and he opened the door. My name is Paul Drake and I work as a private investigator for the office of Perry Mason. I would like to ask you a few questions. The man started to shut the door in his face until Paul told him, we can talk now or in court. It is your choice. Glenn Brown opened the door and let Paul in. The apartment was a neat little place and he took a seat on the couch. Paul looked the man and his wife in the eyes and told them, I know that you work for the developer Thompson Industries and that you were put here to spy on Jason Diamond. I want to know what happened on the day that Jason Fielding was murdered. Where you both were and what your thoughts are on why someone might have wanted Jason Fielding dead, he told them. Sue Brown was the first to speak. We were offered to have a place to live while Glenn worked here at the developers. All we were supposed to do was report on what Jerry did during the day, be friendly to him, find out what he liked and find out the best way to convince him to sell. Originally we were told that it should not take more than 6 months, but Jerry would not move. Also, is such a nice man and he treats us like we were his family. Neither one of us wanted to do anything bad to him, she told Paul. Glenn was a little more fidgety but he opened up. I have worked for Thompson Industries for the past 5 years. My wife and I move into buildings and secretly spy on the owners. Some of the owners are not very nice and are easy to spy on, but Jerry, he is a gem. He is a genuinely kind man and if he wants to stay here I think that we should let him. I have been working with my foreman to convince Dean Kirk that it would be better to let the building stay there with the old clock shop. It might help give the place character. I am not sure that I will be able to work it out, but I am working on it. The day of the murder I was at work, Glenn told Paul. Something about the two of them told Paul that they were telling the truth. That had been one of the tactics that Thompson Industries had used in the past. Thank you for your time, Paul told them and left for home. The next morning, shortly after Perry entered his office, the familiar knock came on the door. It was Paul and he was there to tell them of his conversation with the Browns. I think that they are telling the truth, Perry. It is a tactic that has been used with success in the past by that company. Glenn showed me his time card and he was on the time clock at 6 a.m. that morning. He did not stop work until after 4 that day. I am going to go over there this morning and check with some of the other workers, but it looked like a normal day of work for him. According to the time card that he showed me, those are his normal hours 5 days a week. Let me know anything that you find out. I have a feeling that the murderer is right in front of us and we have just overlooked him or her, Perry told him, and with that Paul left the office once again. Perry and Della worked all day going over the records that were public on Thompson Industries. So far they owned 80% of the buildings in the neighborhood. There was one other building that had not been sold to them. It was a smaller building but the tenants had refused to leave also. Dean Kirk had offered nearly twice its value and had been turned down. But nothing had happened to the tenants except for the Board of Health coming and a building inspector had shown up. Nothing had come of it so far. Perry was starting to think that the murder might not have anything to do with the developer at all. Perry was deep in thought. If the murderer had nothing to do with the developer, who else would profit from Jason's murder? How much life insurance did he carry? Who was the benefactor? Was it his wife or someone else? Perry was going to have to find out that information. It was time for Della and Perry to go and watch what was going on at Jason's brother's house. He had not been a suspect at first, but when Della had done a cross-check, his name and had come up as an investor. His name was Doug Fielding. At one time Doug had expressed interest in working on the old clocks. Perry thought that he was worth watching for one night anyways. Perry leaned over Della's shoulder and kissed her hair softly. It is time for us to leave. It is late once again, he said to her sweetly. Would you like to go with me to a stakeout? He murmured in her hair. Della could no longer resist Perry when he touched her. I think it sounds like fun to me. But first I need to eat dinner. Can you stand my company? Della turned and looked up into his eyes. Dinner is on me, my dear. Perry told her with that. He took her in his arms and gave her a passionate kiss until they had to come up for air. Maybe we can neck while we are out on the stakeout, he laughed. As long as we are together I don't care. But if someone goes by we can put on a good act. But maybe it won't be an act, haha, she told him. Perry called Paul to let him know where he and Della were going to be, and then the two of them headed out to dinner and then the long stakeout. Perry pulled his car up just 3 houses down from Doug Fielding's house. Perry and Della sat down and relaxed for a long boring night, but at least they were together and could enjoy each other's company. As the time went by, the two of them were getting very bored. Della could tell that Perry was in full work mode as he sat intently watching the house. Twice people had gone by and they had kissed, but that was it. They had been outside of the house for 3 hours when finally something happened. They watched as Dean Kirk walked up the walkway and was let in by Doug Fielding. He stayed there about 15 minutes and then left. The two sat there until after midnight and decided to call it a night. Come on, Della. Let's go home. Perry told her. Your house or mine, she said. She did not know why she said it, but she was tired. Perry turned and looked at Della and wanted them to go to his house for some privacy. But it was way too late for that, and Della needed to go home and get some sleep. Maybe someday our house is all he could say to her. Della laid back and smiled. This was what she wanted to hear. Someday was fine with her. When they arrived back at Della's house, Perry walked her to the door. Would you like to come in? Della asked him. Of course, but it is very late and we both have a lot of work to do tomorrow. He looked at her and could see that she wanted him to come in as much as he wanted her to. All right, for a few minutes that would be all right, he told her. As Della felt for the light, Perry took her in his arms and kissed her very tenderly but passionately, and then cupped her chin in his hand. Della, we can't keep doing this. We are being bad, you know. I do not care, Mr. Mason, I am in love. Della told him and threw her arms around his neck. Perry then nestled his mouth into her neck and softly kissed her ear. Della melted into his arms, and before either one of them knew it, they were on the couch making out. Neither one of them wanted to stop and were quite into the scene when Lori and Mike walked into the home. Lori and Mike had done their normal thing, making enough noise to wake the dead, but Della and Perry had not heard them on this night. Neither one of them were indecent, but Perry had loosened his tie and his shirt was partially unbuttoned. As for Della, her hair and clothes were a disaster. Lori smiled and looked away. It was good that her sister was human. She and Mike had slept together. several times now, and she had been afraid to let her sister know. She and Perry were always so prim and proper about their relationship. As she and Mike walked by, they smiled, and Lori told them, "Don't mind us, we didn't see too much," and she and Mike giggled as they went into the kitchen. The spell was broken, and Della and Perry straightened themselves out before going into the kitchen. Della was so embarrassed. Lori was her younger sister, and it was her job to set a good example for her. To be caught on a couch making out the way she and Perry had been making out was meant for a more private time, not for other people to see. They would have to be more careful. Della and Perry came into the kitchen and found Lori and Mike having a glass of ice-cold lemonade. It had been oppressively hot that night, and the lemonade looked good to them. Della walked over to the refrigerator, ate her, and got out some lemonade for her and Perry. The four of them sat down at the kitchen table and smiled. "So how is the newly engaged couple doing?" Perry asked them with a smile. "We are fine and have started to look at places where we could have our wedding and reception. One of our favorite places is at the Glendale Country Club. We could get married at my church and then take a carriage up to the country club. It sounds like the kind of place that we both would like to get married at. They have facilities that can hold up to 250 people." Lori told them. "How many people do you think that you would like to have come to your wedding?" Della asked. "We are thinking somewhere around 200. We probably will invite about 250, but we know that not all of the people invited will come." Lori told them. "My family is small, but they will all be there. I have a sister and she has a husband and 2 children, and then I have an aunt and uncle and their boy. That is all that I have other than my mother and father. The rest will be all family and friends of ours, and then the street family." "That sounds so good. I wish the both of you the best," Perry told them with a smile. "I need to go home now. Work comes early, and Della and I are hoping to solve this murder case soon." Della walked out to the front door and kissed Perry goodbye. It had been a good night after all, and she knew that there would be more of them to come. Perry got up early that next day, and as he stood at his window that overlooked the city he was heavy in thought, Doug Fielding was involved somehow. He was dealing with Dean Kirk, and perhaps the two of them had more to do with the murder than he had originally thought. He would have Paul look into him more deeply. Perhaps that was the answer to the question, who killed Jason Fielding? When Perry got to the office, he met Della, who was sitting in her private office working on some of the information that they had accumulated on the Thompson Industries. He waved for her to come into the office, and she went willingly in. "I have been pondering the thought of Dean Kirk and Doug Fielding perhaps having something to do with this murder. I think that they are both more involved than was originally thought. Get hold of Paul and tell him to look into the relationship between Dean Kirk and Doug Fielding. Something did not seem right when he went over last night. You see, when I came to work this morning, I decided to go by Doug Fielding's house and found that Dean Kirk's car was in the driveway and the engine was cold," Perry told Della. Dean Kirk sat at his desk in his private office and pondered some of his thoughts. This new development had been trouble since the start. He had to put up too much money, and he had met roadblocks on every corner. Nothing had gone right, and now the police had questioned him about the murder of a man that he had never met by the name of Jason Fielding. He had not put the old man and Doug Fielding together until the police came. He had heard of the murder, of course, but knew nothing about it. But now he was in the middle of a real mess. What to do? He was going to have to think about this one. Perhaps he should just be happy with the way the project was and cut his losses. Dean kept walking back and forth across the floor. He did not like not being in control. This was not the type of man that he was. He had started his career as a flipper of a house, for crying out loud. He now owned one of the biggest developing companies in the city of LA. Nothing was going to take away his hard work. He needed to find out who had murdered that man. "Max, I want to see you right away," Dean called over the walkie-talkie. Within a few minutes Max Stratton came into the office. "I want you and your men to look into the murder of Jason Fielding. If you can, I want you to find out who is the murderer. I do not want you going anywhere near Jerry Diamond. He has the lawyer Perry Mason working with him, and I do not want to tangle with him now, not yet. Just see what you can find out about the murder. Be careful and do not do anything illegal. This guy Mason is no one to play around with," Dean warned him.